Picture the scene. It is 1958, and a young woman named Debbie Reynolds, America's sweetheart, the wholesome girl, next door, adored by millions, picks up a telephone in her home and dials a hotel in New York. She is calling to speak to her best friend, one of the most famous women in the world, a woman who had recently been widowed and whom Debbie had been trying to comfort. But when the line connects, it is not her friend who answers. It is a man's voice. And Debbie recognizes it immediately, because it belongs to her own husband. In that instant, standing in her own home with two small children nearby, Debbie Reynolds understood everything. Her husband was in her best friend's hotel room, and when she asked, shakily, to speak to her friend, the woman on the other end of the line reportedly came to the phone and said, in a cold, flat voice, 4 words that would echo through Hollywood history. "What do you want, Debbie?" That friend was Elizabeth Taylor. The husband was Eddie Fisher. And what unfolded from that moment became one of the most notorious betrayals in the history of Hollywood. A scandal so enormous it dominated headlines for years and turned two women who had genuinely loved each other into the most famous rivals in America. The world watched, transfixed, as the wholesome wife and the glamorous seductress became locked in a public drama of heartbreak and revenge. And for decades, everyone assumed they knew the truth, that Debbie Reynolds must have privately, bitterly, secretly hated the woman who stole her husband and shattered her life. But the real story, the one that played out behind closed doors and away from the cameras, is far more complicated, far more painful, and in the end far more surprising than the simple tale of hatred the public believed. Because what Debbie Reynolds actually felt toward Elizabeth Taylor was something the tabloids could never quite capture, and something that would take the rest of both their lives to fully reveal. This is the truth about what really happened between them. And it begins not with hatred at all, but with a deep and genuine friendship. The friendship before the betrayal. To understand how much this betrayal hurt, you first have to understand how close these two women actually were. This was not a case of two strangers or two distant rivals. Debbie Reynolds and Elizabeth Taylor were friends, real friends, and their bond went back years. They had both come up through the same studio system in the golden age of Hollywood. Elizabeth Taylor had been a child star, famous since National Velvet made her a sensation at 12, and the young Debbie Reynolds, before she was famous herself, had actually idolized her. Debbie was a Hollywood-struck girl, fascinated by all the glamour the industry represented. And if any single person embodied that glamour, it was the impossibly beautiful Elizabeth Taylor. When Debbie became a star in her own right, breaking through with her unforgettable performance in Singin' in the Rain, the two young women moved in the same circles, and a genuine friendship formed. By the mid-1950s, that friendship had deepened into something like family. In 1955, Debbie Reynolds married Eddie Fisher, a wildly popular singer and teen idol whose smooth voice and boyish charm had made him one of the biggest recording stars in the country. The two of them became one of Hollywood's first great power couples, crowned America's sweethearts, the wholesome, beloved young pair that the whole country adored. Their romance had been followed in the press like a fairy tale, and their wedding treated as a national event. They seemed, to the millions who adored them, like the perfect embodiment of clean-cut, happily ever after American love. And Elizabeth, for her part, married the flamboyant film producer Mike Todd in 1957. The two couples were not just friendly, they were, by all accounts, inseparable. They were neighbors. They socialized constantly, dining together, sharing the ordinary rhythms of daily life that bind people into something deeper than acquaintance. Eddie Fisher and Mike Todd were especially close, with Eddie idolizing the older, larger-than-life Todd almost like a mentor, following him around with something close to hero worship. In that tight little circle of 4, the two marriages and the two friendships were all wound together into a single web of affection and loyalty. It was the kind of closeness people spend their whole lives hoping to find, and it was about to be destroyed. The bonds ran remarkably deep. When Elizabeth married Mike Todd, Debbie Reynolds stood up at the wedding as her matron of honor, one of the most intimate roles a woman can play in another woman's life. Eddie Fisher served as Mike Todd's best man. These were not casual acquaintances posing for photos. These were two couples woven tightly into each other's lives. And there is perhaps no more touching proof of that closeness than this single fact. When Debbie and Eddie had their second child, a son, in 1958, they named him Todd in honor of Elizabeth's husband, Mike Todd. Think about that. Debbie Reynolds loved this circle of friends so much that she named her own baby boy after Elizabeth Taylor's husband. That is how much these families meant to one another. So when we talk about what came next, we are not talking about a betrayal between rivals. We are talking about a betrayal between two women who had shared the most important moments of their lives, who had stood at each other's weddings, who had raised their children alongside one another, which is exactly why what happened would cut so unimaginably deep. Because the wound Elizabeth Taylor would inflict on Debbie Reynolds was not the wound of an enemy, it was the wound of a sister. And it began, as so many tragedies in this story do, with a sudden and violent death. The death that changed everything. On the 22nd of March 1958, Mike Todd climbed aboard his private plane, a small aircraft he had affectionately named the Lucky Liz in honor of his wife Elizabeth. He was flying from the west coast toward the east for a business engagement. The plane ran into a severe thunderstorm over the Zuni Mountains of New Mexico, and, reportedly overloaded, it crashed. Everyone aboard was killed. Mike Todd was just 48 years old. Elizabeth Taylor was devastated in a way that is difficult to describe. Mike Todd had been, by many accounts, one of the great loves of her life, perhaps the great love, a man whose passion and vitality matched her own completely. His sudden death shattered her. She was 26 years old, a widow with a young daughter, and those around her feared for her, so total was her grief. She was, in that terrible spring of 1958, a woman in genuine crisis, drowning in sorrow. And here is where the story turns, and where Debbie Reynolds' own generosity would come back to break her heart. Because when Elizabeth was at her lowest, it was Eddie Fisher, Debbie's husband and Mike Todd's devoted best friend, who stepped in to comfort the grieving widow. And crucially, Debbie encouraged him to do it. She saw her best friend suffering. She saw her husband's close bond with the man who had died, and she sent Eddie to help Elizabeth through her grief. It was an act of pure friendship and compassion. It was also, though Debbie could not have known it, the beginning of the end of her marriage. This is the detail that makes the whole story so achingly tragic, and it is worth pausing on. Debbie Reynolds was not a careless or neglectful wife who drove her husband away. She was, if anything, too generous, too trusting. She looked at a grieving friend and a heartbroken husband, and did the kind, decent thing, sending the man she loved to comfort the woman she loved, never imagining that her own goodness would be turned into the instrument of her betrayal. There is an old, cruel truth in that. Sometimes it is precisely our best qualities, our compassion, our trust, our willingness to think the best of the people we love, that leave us most exposed to being hurt. Debbie handed Eddie and Elizabeth the very opportunity that would destroy her family, and she did it out of love. That is the kind of irony that can haunt a person for a lifetime, because the comfort Eddie Fisher offered Elizabeth Taylor did not stay comfort for long. Within roughly a month of Mike Todd's death, the consolation between the grieving widow and the married best friend had turned into something else entirely. It had become an affair. The two of them, drawn together in the strange, heightened, emotional atmosphere of that tragedy, crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. And they did it in secret, behind the back of the woman who had sent Eddie to help in the first place. Their daughter, Carrie Fisher, who would grow up to become a beloved star in her own right, later described the whole sordid sequence with the dark, unflinching wit that made her famous. She wrote that her father flew to Elizabeth's side, first drying her eyes, then consoling her with flowers, and ultimately consoling her in a far more intimate way, which, as Carrie dryly observed, made her father's marriage to her mother rather awkward. He was, she wrote, gone within the week. It was a brutally funny way to describe what was, for her mother, an absolute catastrophe. And that catastrophe struck Debbie Reynolds when she was at her most vulnerable, because she had just given birth. She was a new mother of two tiny children, an infant son and a toddler daughter. When she discovered that her husband and her best friend had betrayed her, the timing could hardly have been crueler. While she was caring for a newborn, The two people she trusted most in the world were carrying on an affair behind her back. And she, as she would say for the rest of her life, was the very last to know. The last to know. There is a particular kind of humiliation in being the last person to learn a secret that everyone else already knows, and Debbie Reynolds lived through exactly that. She later described how the truth slowly dawned on her. There had been hints in the newspapers, whispers she did not understand. She noticed that when she arrived at parties and functions alone without Eddie, her friends would go quiet, exchanging glances, murmuring to one another. Something was wrong, and everyone around her seemed to know what it was except her. By some accounts, the full, undeniable truth arrived through that infamous phone call when Debbie rang Elizabeth's hotel room in New York and heard her own husband's voice answer. In that moment, the whispers and the strange looks and the newspaper hints all collapsed into a single, unbearable certainty. Her husband was with her best friend, and Elizabeth's reportedly cold greeting, asking what Debbie wanted, told her everything about how completely their friendship had been abandoned. For Debbie Reynolds, this was not one betrayal, but two, layered on top of each other, and that is the key to understanding the depth of her pain. She had not only lost her husband, the father of her two young children. She had lost her best friend, the woman she had idolized, stood beside at her wedding, and named her son's namesake in honor of. Many people who go through a divorce, at least, have their friends to lean on. Debbie had to absorb the shattering of her marriage and the shattering of her closest friendship in the very same blow, delivered by the very same event. The two wounds were inseparable, and together they nearly destroyed her. She was, in her own words, shattered. And she was also, in a way that seems almost quaint now, but was very real then, genuinely bewildered by the moral situation she found herself in. Debbie had been raised religiously and conservatively. She had, as she later put it with characteristic frankness, been a virgin when she married Eddie. And she did not believe in divorce. She had two children, and a deep conviction that marriage was for life. And yet here she was, publicly abandoned, with the guilt somehow being turned back onto her. She described how she was made to feel that by refusing to simply let Eddie go, she was the one standing in the way of true love, keeping two people who belonged together apart. Imagine the cruelty of that, being cheated on, and then being made to feel guilty for not stepping aside quickly enough. Eventually, worn down, she gave in. She let Eddie go. She told him to leave. The public spectacle that followed was enormous. One of the biggest celebrity scandals of the entire era, and it split cleanly along the lines the tabloids loved. On one side stood Debbie Reynolds, cast as the innocent, wronged, wholesome wife, the mother of two, America's betrayed sweetheart. The image of her, sometimes shown with a diaper pin on her blouse to emphasize her role as a devoted young mother, became the very picture of injured virtue. Photographers captured her looking brave and heartbroken, and the country rallied around her, flooding her with sympathy. On the other side stood Elizabeth Taylor, cast as the raven-haired seductress, the home-wrecking villainess who had stolen a good woman's husband while that woman was busy raising babies. The public turned on Elizabeth with startling ferocity, branding her a scarlet woman and a shameless predator, and the scandal did real damage. Eddie Fisher's popular television show was cancelled, his carefully cultivated wholesome image shattered overnight. It is worth noting how neatly the blame fell, and how unfairly. As so often happens in these stories, the two women bore the brunt of the public judgment, painted as rivals fighting over a prize, while the man at the centre of it, the husband who had actually broken his marriage vows, largely escaped the harshest condemnation. The narrative demanded a villainess and a victim, a catfight between women, and the press was only too happy to supply one. Lost in all of it was any acknowledgement that a grieving widow and a straying husband were the actual authors of the tragedy, and that Debbie and Elizabeth were, in their different ways, both being wounded by the same man's choices. And Elizabeth, for her part, did not exactly play the penitent, at least not at first. When confronted about the affair by the powerful and feared gossip columnist Hedda Hopper, she reportedly delivered a line of breathtaking coldness, suggesting that she could not possibly have broken up a happy marriage because Debbie and Eddie's marriage had never been happy to begin with. It was the kind of remark that poured salt directly into the wound, publicly dismissing the very marriage Debbie was grieving, and it cemented Elizabeth's image as the unrepentant villain of the piece. Whether Elizabeth truly believed it, or was simply a grieving, defensive woman lashing out under enormous pressure, the effect was the same. It made her look heartless, and it deepened the public's fury. In 1959, Eddie Fisher divorced Debbie and married Elizabeth almost immediately, reportedly within hours of the divorce being finalized, in a Las Vegas ceremony that felt like a final, public slap to the woman he had left behind. The betrayal was, at that point, complete. Debbie Reynolds had lost her husband, lost her best friend, and been forced to watch the two of them wed while the whole world looked on. If the story had ended there, it would have been simply one of Hollywood's cruelest tales of betrayal. So the public had its narrative, the sweet wife and the wicked temptress, and everyone assumed that behind her dignified public face, Debbie Reynolds must have burned with hatred for the woman who had done this to her. But here is where the real story, the secret story, begins to diverge from what everyone believed. The hatred she was supposed to feel. By every reasonable measure, Debbie Reynolds had earned the right to hate Elizabeth Taylor. The woman had taken her husband, humiliated her before the entire world, dissolved a friendship Debbie had treasured, and shown, at least in those early days, remarkably little remorse about any of it. If ever a person had grounds for lifelong bitterness, it was Debbie Reynolds in 1959, and the world fully expected her to feel it. The whole narrative of the scandal depended on it, the wronged woman nursing her wounds, forever set against her glamorous rival. And privately, make no mistake, Debbie was in agony. The graceful public composure she managed to maintain hid a genuine devastation. Her friends saw it. One of her closest companions later described how the betrayal blindsided her completely. How it was an enormous shock from which any woman would have felt utterly defeated. Debbie had built her life around this marriage and this friendship, and both had been ripped away at once, leaving her a single mother of two in the harsh glare of public scrutiny. The pain was real, and it was profound, and she carried it privately even as she held her head high in public. That contrast, between the brave face and the private anguish, is the real heart of the secret. Because the world only ever saw the composed, dignified Debbie, the good sport, the class act who never publicly wept or raged or tore Elizabeth Taylor to pieces in the press. And people mistook that composure for either saintly forgiveness or icy hatred, depending on which story they preferred. The truth was neither. Behind the poise was a young woman genuinely broken, blindsided, and humiliated, doing the enormously difficult work of holding herself together for the sake of her two small children while the entire country watched her marriage collapse. What looked from the outside like effortless grace was in fact hard, private, grinding survival. The dignity was real, but so was the suffering it was covering, and that is precisely what made it dignity in the first place. It costs nothing to stay composed when you are not in pain. Debbie stayed composed while in a great deal of it. But here is the secret at the heart of this whole story, the thing that complicates the simple tale of hatred. Debbie Reynolds' deepest anger, it turned out, was not aimed where the world assumed, because when Debbie looked clearly at what had happened to her, she came to a conclusion that was as wise as it was hard-won. She understood that the person who had truly betrayed her marriage vows was not Elizabeth. It was Eddie. He was her husband. He was the one who had made promises to her, the one who had fathered her children, the one who had chosen to walk away. As Debbie herself would later put it with piercing clarity, a man does not leave a woman for another woman unless he wants to go. The responsibility, she came to believe, lay with the man who left, not solely with the woman he left for. And there was something else. Something that reveals the remarkable generosity of Debbie's character, even in the depths of her pain. She came to suspect that Elizabeth had never even really loved Eddie Fisher at all. In her clearer moments, Debbie understood that Elizabeth had been drowning in grief over Mike Todd, and that Eddie had simply been there, a lifeline in a moment of unbearable loss, an interim comfort during her mourning rather than a genuine love. Debbie would later say almost exactly this, that she did not believe Elizabeth had truly loved Eddie, that he had merely been an interest during her period of grief. If that was true, Then the whole tragedy took on a different and sadder shape. It was not so much a great villainous theft as it was two wounded, grieving people making a terrible mistake and a marriage getting destroyed in the process. This did not erase Debbie's hurt. The years of estrangement that followed were real. Through the early 1960s, as Elizabeth divorced Eddie and moved on to her legendary romance with Richard Burton, and as Debbie remarried and tried to rebuild her own life, the two women remained apart, their once deep friendship frozen. Debbie did not chase a reconciliation, and neither did Elizabeth. The wound was too fresh, the scandal too enormous. For years, they were simply two women who had once loved each other and now lived separate lives, forever linked in the public imagination by the man who had come between them. But the notion that Debbie Reynolds spent her life secretly hating Elizabeth Taylor turns out to be, in the end, not quite true. What she felt was more complicated than hatred. A tangle of hurt and understanding and old affection that never entirely died. And that complexity would eventually lead to one of the most unexpected reconciliations in Hollywood history, in the unlikeliest of settings. The reconciliation nobody expected. The turning point came in 1966, and it happened almost by pure accident, aboard a ship. Debbie Reynolds, now remarried to the businessman Harry Carl, was preparing to board a transatlantic ocean liner in New York, bound for England. The ship, in a twist so perfect no screenwriter would dare invent it, was named the Queen Elizabeth. And as Debbie prepared to board, she discovered that also sailing on that very ship was none other than Elizabeth Taylor, now married to Richard Burton. Debbie's first instinct was to flee. The idea of being trapped on a ship for days with the woman at the center of the most painful chapter of her life was almost too much to bear, and she reportedly nearly abandoned the trip altogether, standing on the dock and seriously considering turning around and going home. It is easy to understand why. There is no more inescapable place than a ship at sea. Once those gangways are raised, there is nowhere to hide, no way to leave, no avoiding the person you least want to face. For a woman still carrying the wound of the most public betrayal in America, the prospect must have been genuinely frightening. But her husband insisted she go, urging her not to let the past dictate her life, and so Debbie steeled herself and boarded. And there, in the strange enforced closeness of a cruise ship crossing the Atlantic, something remarkable happened. Debbie sent a note to Elizabeth. Elizabeth sent a note back. And in that small, tentative exchange of messages passing between them, the ice of nearly a decade began, at last, to crack. Before long, the two women were talking. And then, to the absolute delight of the tabloids who could scarcely believe their luck, the two former friends and their new husbands, Debbie and Harry Carl, Elizabeth and Richard Burton, sat down and had dinner together aboard the ship. The wronged wife and the woman who had wronged her, breaking bread at the same table, laughing together once more. From that night forward, according to Debbie's own son, Elizabeth and Richard were welcome in their lives again. What allowed this to happen? Partly it was simply time, which softens even the deepest wounds. Partly it was the fact that both women had moved on, that the marriage they had fought over was long dissolved, that Eddie Fisher was now in the past for both of them. And partly, one suspects, it was that the friendship these two women had shared before the scandal had been genuine, and genuine things are hard to kill entirely. Beneath all the pain, some ember of the old affection had survived, waiting for the chance to be rekindled. Years later, Elizabeth did something that sealed the reconciliation completely. She sought Debbie out and, in effect, apologized. Not only to Debbie, but eventually to Debbie's children as well. According to Debbie's son Todd, Elizabeth insisted on telling him in detail what she had truly been feeling in those terrible days of 1958, explaining that her involvement with Eddie had been a tragic rebound off the death of the great love of her life, Mike Todd. It was at last an honest accounting, and it allowed the families to fully heal. Debbie's children accepted the apology. The old wound was finally closing. The depth of the reconciliation revealed itself in ways both large and small over the following decades. The two women, who had once been the most famous rivals in America, became genuine friends again, and their bond only deepened as they aged. There is a striking detail from the 11th of September 2001. When the terrorist attacks struck New York and both women found themselves stranded in the city, it was Elizabeth Taylor who offered Debbie Reynolds refuge, a place to stay at her hotel until the chaos subsided. The woman who had once coldly asked what Debbie wanted on the telephone was now, more than 40 years later, opening her door to her in a moment of crisis. And then came the most beautiful full-circle moment of all. In 2001, the two women co-starred together in a television movie called These Old Broads, a comedy about aging Hollywood actresses reuniting after years apart. On its own, that would have been remarkable enough, the two former rivals sharing the screen and gently poking fun at their own legendary history. The two of them were reportedly caught good-naturedly bickering on set, the way only old friends with a long, complicated history can. And they even slipped a knowing joke about Eddie Fisher into the film itself, turning the very source of their old pain into a shared punchline. To be able to laugh together about the man who had once torn their lives apart was, in itself, a kind of triumph. Proof of just how far they had travelled from those bitter days of 1958. But the truly extraordinary thing was who wrote the film. It was written by Carrie Fisher, Debbie's daughter, the child who had been an infant when the scandal broke, the little girl whose family had been torn apart by this very affair. Think about the poetry of that. The baby whose home was shattered by the Fisher-Taylor affair grew up to become a brilliant writer, and then used that gift to script the project that reunited her mother and Elizabeth Taylor, the very woman at the center of it all, on screen, as friends, for the world to see. Carrie Fisher, with her characteristic wit and hard-won wisdom about her own chaotic family, transformed her family's old tragedy into something warm and funny and healing. It was, in every sense, the closing of a circle that had been broken for more than 40 years, and it took 3 generations of these entangled families to complete it. What the story really tells us. So, did Debbie Reynolds secretly hate Elizabeth Taylor? The honest answer is that for a time she had every reason to, and privately she carried a hurt far deeper than her graceful public face ever revealed. The betrayal was real. The devastation was real. The years of estrangement were real. Anyone who tells you Debbie simply forgave and forgot in an instant is not telling the truth. She was a woman who was profoundly wronged, and she felt the full weight of it. But the secret that the tabloid narrative never captured is that hatred is not where the story ended, and perhaps not even where it truly lived. What Debbie Reynolds felt was something far more human and far more difficult than simple hatred. It was the complicated grief of losing someone she had loved, tangled up with a hard-won wisdom about where the blame really belonged, and shadowed always by the memory of a genuine friendship that had meant the world to her. She directed her deepest disappointment at the husband who broke his vows, not solely at the grieving widow he turned to. And in the end, she found her way not to revenge but to reconciliation. There is a real lesson buried in this story, one that has nothing to do with Hollywood glamour. It is about the difference between the version of events the world writes for us and the messier, truer version we actually live. The public wanted a simple story of a wronged saint and a wicked seductress, 2 women locked in eternal hatred. The reality was 2 flawed, grieving human beings who hurt each other terribly and then, given enough time and enough grace, found their way back to something like love. Debbie Reynolds could have spent her life as a professional victim, nursing her grievance, and no one would have blamed her. Instead, she chose eventually to let it go, and to reclaim the friendship the scandal had stolen from her. When Debbie Reynolds died in December of 2016, just one single day after the death of her own beloved daughter, Carrie Fisher, she had long since made her peace with Elizabeth Taylor, who had passed away 5 years earlier. The 2 women had shared a friendship that spanned more than half a century, one that had been broken by one of the greatest betrayals in Hollywood history and then, astonishingly, put back together. The story the world remembers, of secret hatred and bitter rivalry, is only the first act of a much longer and much more redemptive tale. The truth is that Debbie Reynolds did not let the worst thing that ever happened to her define the rest of her life. And in choosing forgiveness over hatred, she proved herself to be exactly the class act, the strong and gracious woman that the public had always believed her to be, though for reasons far deeper than they ever knew. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.